we get experimental science. We're curious, non-judgmental.
Science news story of the week, y'all, is about the Bilby. There is the paper, published in the journal Animal Behavior, which is like a medium-tier journal. Nothing too fancy about it, but it's very much on the specialty journal. And this paper is looking at the Bilby, which you might be like, Balint, what on earth is the Bilby? And I did have an image. Hold on. There is the photo. That's why I got confused. There it is. Look at that. Look at that Bilby right there. It's a little marsupial creature. It is the Easter Bunny of Australia, is what it's colloquially known as. And one of the fortunate things is it's been a lot, akin to habitat loss. A little bit like we were talking about the fish, except with the fish, it's actually gone extinct. The fish, this little guy has not, although it is on that little bit of a precipice where we're approaching the possibility that we might lose this little creature. So, in order to avoid losing this little creature, there's a new publication has dropped on where it might live and how it might live and how well it might live. And so what we're going to be looking at here in this study is actually GPS tagging bilbies that are released into the wild to try to figure out what kind of locations they best live in. And in particular for this would be different types of soil in a temperate environment, which is not an environment that it's ever been released in. Highly endangered, yes indeed, Tiff. It is, I wonder if it's even maybe critically endangered on this front here. Greater Bilby, small nocturnal mammal. Yep, they occupy less than 20% of their original habitat. Largely constrained to the drier regions. This is a combination due to threats including predation, competition introduced with other species, habitat loss, and degradation. They do breed in captivity. Establishment of introduced foxes in the southern temperate region. So foxes that have been introduced that also ended up taking them out. So there's a lot of things going against these creatures. But this was a means to look at how we can introduce bilbies back into the wild. But there is a sanctuary the bilby have been breeding in. That was one of the questions from the chat. Can you breed them in the lab? In the sanctuary, they are breeding them, and there's lots of them. And what they were trying to figure out is in the temperate region of southern Australia, which there is a map of in the paper, this little location marked in the blue, purple, whatever you want to call it, in that region of Australia that's the temperate climate. The bilbies used to be all over in that area. But there's all these foxes there now that eat the bilbies. And so, what do we do about it? We need to do something, right? So we don't know how they're going to respond. So even if you did start releasing them, what's going to happen to them? We just don't know. So they actually haven't lived in this range where they had lived, very highly populated, for over 100 years. There's been 0 bilbies here. But now, and again, the reason that their population is decreasing, as we talked about, predation by foxes, also cats, and apparently also invasive rabbits that have eaten their food sources. So the researchers decided we need to try to reintroduce these bilbies to this temperate region of Australia. And how can we do that is the question. And what does the bilby do when it is released into this temperate area? How well do they survive? What regions of the temperate area do they survive well in? And what about those regions makes it good for bilby survival? And why this is important, y'all, is if you're going to be releasing these creatures into this temperate region of Australia, you have to know what regions are good for releasing, right? Like, what about the regions is going to be indicative of these animals doing well, surviving well? What do we need to pay attention to? And so that was the big goal here. So they released a large set, relatively speaking, 18, I think it's 18 male and 13 female bilbies that were GPS tagged and looked at over the course of multiple seasons where they hung out in and how well they did. They also surveyed the area for food, soil type, everything that bilbies might like and more, which I thought was really, really cool. Also, the difficulties in some of these things in studying them is that they are nocturnal, and so it is a little bit difficult to see, at night where they're going, which is, again, why they're tagged. So one thing that's neat about the bilbies, y'all, turns out that they do a lot of digging in the soil. And this digging is important because it aerates the soil and improves soil health. So in areas where there are bilbies, plants do better. Why do they dig? Have underground little tunnels that they have. It turns out the females are the ones that provide all the childcare. The males mate and run off. So while they are marsupials, once the babies are big enough to be out of the pouch, the mom digs these tunnels and keeps the baby bilbies down there in the tunnel systems. And that's what contributes to the aeration of the soil, which means that other plants can do well and survive well here. The males, again, are off in different areas. And this is the first study where they're looking at nicely male and female behavior and location of where they're hanging out at. It turns out the big thing that's driving these behaviors is amounts of food. So it turns out, we'll look at the data as well, that females are more sensitive to the location and seasonal availability of resources when compared to the males. The males don't return to the breeding burrows, and they just kind of went all over the map in terms of the location that they were examined in. And probably the reason for that is because if they're just looking for mates, they're just going to be crossing all over the area, and whatever works best for them is where they're going to be examining and hanging out. The females need to stay put in the location while their babies are developing, and they need to have areas where there's high feeding opportunity for food. And what do they eat? Beetles, termites, crickets, larvae are the big things that these animals are eating. So what's really, really cool is they had a lot of, I'll show you all the experiments that they set up in order to catch the invertebrates that the animals were eating. So they can get an actual metric of, in the areas that the females and the males are hanging out, what does the food look like? What is the density of food? And that's really cool. They went up, I think, really above and beyond to try to figure out where these animals survive the best. And so again, they're looking for a sufficiency of what's driving where these animals are going to be going to. And they only have a really small part of the story. Even at the end of the day, with all this data going into it, they don't fully know what the most important factors are. But now they have, for any future Bilby reintroduction to the temperate area, which is what one of the big goals are, they kind of know what they are looking for the likelihood of there being a successful reintroduction of the Bilby. Without that, there might be, there's no knowledge of what is actually required for the Bilbys to be reintroduced. We will get into the data too. This is 8 days ago. The paper just came out. This is a brand new study, and this is looking at the Bilbys that were out for several seasons. So they released these Bilbys, y'all. Let me just make sure I'm having the dates correctly in the paper. Cost a couple of seasons. They did a couple of winters and summers. 2021 is when they started the study. So it was a multi-year study. So they recollected some of them with those GPS tags, do a little bit of a health check, and then they were letting them right back. They tagged them. So they actually are bred at a sanctuary, and then they were released into this temperate region of Australia, of southern Australia, where in fact they used to live, but not for over 100 years have they lived in that area. I'll show you all some of the experiments that they did to figure out the density of animals and what they were feeding on, which I was just like, whoa, that's so cool that they did experiments like that. Again, to try to ascertain what is going well, what is the areas that they're liking. In this zone, what about the temperate zone, this little region that they're releasing them in, which is protected from predators, they have fenced off things and everything. What about this is good in terms of site selection for these animals? Okay. Because they have no data. They just knew that they were in this temperate zone 100 years ago, and now they're not. And so, what if we release more? What are we looking for in terms of release?
Okay, all right, wait, hang on. Let's just rewind. So they have an area that's closed off from predators. Does that also include the rabbits and the other invasive shenanigans that they don't want to? It's all out of there.
This is a lower region of a sanctuary in the temperate zone that's been carved out for these creatures. Okay. And what they were trying to identify was, what about this area? Where are they successful? In this area that they're releasing them in, what is something that they're looking for future releases? Okay. Because there's just no data on it. And so
they're looking to see of the area that they've provided.
Which has a bunch of different types of soils. It has different food sources and densities throughout.
They're trying to see what sub-habitat is their jam.
And how is it different between male and female? If it's different.
How is it different? All the ladies are working, that's how it's different. Right. Do they know anything about range and stuff if the males aren't participating in offspring care?
They did not know that ahead of time, but the males did travel further because they were, as you said, making the rounds. Yeah. And so it turns out the females are driven by food, so they will make a nesting site in areas of high food. Sure. And the male, and also soil.
They don't want to drive too far to the grocery store. I gotcha.
And it's also linked to soil quality. Yeah. So how good the soil's quality is. So the males are more likely to be in poorer soil quality as well, where it's more likely to have a cave-in. So the way that they measured the food I thought was a pretty clever trick. Also, like, here's again the area. They looked for 3 years, or I think 2 winters and 3 summers.
Okay.
Which then the ecosystem changed over that time. These were traps that they used to catch invertebrates to look at food density. So they had these traps out that they sampled multiple times a week to see what kind of food sources were caught and where they were. So how the food changed over time.
Okay.
Along with, they also sampled soil quality and then had the GPS trackers of the Bilbys.
If they're measuring the food over time and they're also watching these little cute furry critters change their habitat over time, can they tell if how much of an effect the little furries are having on the food content rather than where they're moving based on how the food is changing?
It didn't seem to have
correlation versus causation.
Didn't seem to have enough numbers to have that kind of effect. They just had the seasonal change graph near the end, which is like was a little heat map of where the food was located.
Okay.
And it just, here it is. So it just, these things shifted with season.
Okay.
So like summer versus winter months, and it just like was they set a pretty like repeatable thing of how it shifted over the winter and summer months. I don't think they were enough to have negatively affected them. They did say that they found they intentionally released not a very high number of them, and they found that their ranges are actually pretty large. That they would need. So if they had released like triple the number, let's say, it would have been too dense, even though like you wouldn't have necessarily suspected that, but given the ranges that they were moving around in, they actually had like a larger than expected range.
Okay, all right, but hang on. You said there weren't enough released. I just want to be clear. It's not necessarily that they're eating these little guys. You said that they were ecosystem engineers, that by aerating the soil, they actually change the immediate ecosystem, which could also change the kind of invertebrates. If it changes the kind of plants that are in the area, could it not also change the kind of insects that are in the area?
It could,
That's
but
my
it
question.
didn't.
It didn't. Okay.
At least it was not reported on as a change. They had like the categories that they had set out of like different kinds of insects, and that those were still being caught and then pulled in.
Do they get eaten by dingoes?
Everyone gets eaten by dingoes. Bigger predator is the invasive fox. That's the issue. And then rabbits outcompeting them. I just thought it was a cool little device that they used to measure, like the homemade device to catch the invertebrates. And so it was just like this little water trap where they, the invertebrate would fall in and they would check and categorize.
Gets stuck.
Yeah.
It gets stuck in a little swimming pool of doom.
Well, that made it dark.
I mean,
no,
how
you're not
long
wrong.
was the insect in there? Did they just release them when they were done? Or you said they checked every 24 hours?
No, it was a couple of times a week, so no.
Oh, well,
then here are the physical changes in the different seasons. So, like, this is the same site that they were looking at. So this is a summer, winter, spring, and summer from the same area as that you're getting to see change. So they have that resolution of data as well, which I thought was interesting. Okay. Apparently, proximity to water makes it more likely to have a cave-in, and the males had a higher proximity toward water. I wonder if it would be something where if they're going on the water, or if they're moving between the sources and like they're going towards water, maybe like you said for a different food source, but they didn't map. They weren't able to get the resolution of figuring out what each sex is eating. I don't know. There was a lot of info, I thought, but there could have definitely been more.
Are they talking about a similar reintroduction program, or this is the one that they were talking about for that paper? Because you said it was a breeding facility, like they were captive bred.
Sorry, it was a sanctuary.
Okay.
Where they had, it was kind of like, when looking up the location, it kind of felt like the black-footed ferret site.
Okay.
Where there were wild ones.
Yeah.
But then there were also ones that were indoors where they were playing matchmaking, and they released ones of like...
But they were out collecting wild ones. I guess the reason I'm asking is because these were not... It sounds like they were not reared by humans.
No, these were not the genetically valuable ones, like the black-footed... Like, similar to, I guess, the black-footed ferret ones. Like, I didn't say this, but I wonder if it was something like, well, if something goes awry...
So rude. It's not his terminology. It's common in the field. There's the genetically valuable ones, and then there's like the other ones. You know, it's not you.
I know.
It's not you. It's just always, oh, that's rude.
That I get is that they were.
That's fine. No, I was just wondering because their behavior. You can imagine in these breeding facilities where they're actually in a facility, the caretakers do everything they can to minimize contact with these creatures and to try to simulate the natural environment and like their hunting behaviors, except like everything they're going to need to do to live out in the wild. But sometimes, despite best efforts, these guys are still going to act differently when they're out and about for the first time. So it's interesting that they actually collected ones that were already out doing their little critter thing.
It makes sense that they would catch them, because if they're trying to sort of see like natural behavior and survival and preferences.
Okay.
Like,
No, I
get
get
that that's
I
what
get
they
it.
would release. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's a very good point, though.